Okay, so today we're going to be focusing on imperialism. Now your textbook breaks it up into two basically sections of imperialism in Africa and imperialism in Asia. So for the purpose of the video today, we're going to go ahead and just focus primarily on imperialism in Africa. So the things we're going to talk about as well in this video is we're going to go ahead and get into what the motivations were. A lot of them are things that we had covered back in colonialism with the God, glory, and gold aspect. There are a few more things in here that I've already addressed in class, things like the white man's burden. We'll be talking about the effects of imperialism on Africa. Some of them are pretty obvious, but some of them might be surprising to you. So that's about it. Let's go ahead and get into getting through the lesson. Alright, so we're going to get started. As you can see, we're going to be in Unit 8, Lesson 8, and obviously this is Coronavirus Break Edition because we're not going to be in school for like 3 weeks, so let's see what we can get done today. As I already talked about in the introduction, we're talking about imperialism. We're going to focus pretty much just on Africa today. In our next lesson, I'll spend some time going over Asia. Let's get into what we're supposed to do. Your little warm-up, listen, describe the main causes of colonialism. So that was the topic we covered back. It was like our second unit, I believe, right after the Renaissance. And I kind of gave them away inside of the introductory video. So go ahead and take a moment and think about that. Okay, so let's go ahead and get some learning targets out of the way. So our learning targets, these are basically the learning objectives that come from College Board. So I'm going to stop talking for a little bit and just kind of let you examine what our learning targets are, what our success criteria is, and what our essential questions are going to be. Okay, so what is new imperialism? It's essentially colonialism with a slightly different spin. And what do I mean by that? Well, we'll get into our recurring themes here. Okay, so religion, humanitarianism, we know that that was part of colonialism, so that thing is the same. I highlighted the only thing that's really different as far as a major, change from colonialism to imperialism. That would be social Darwinism. And we've talked about that in class, where basically it's trying to prove that you're better than other races or other nationalities too, because remember, racism and nationalism both take a play in here, and so part of that becomes competition with other countries, trying to gobble up as much territory as possible to basically show that you're the best. Balance of power too. So one of the things that it talks about in your textbook is that places like Britain would go ahead and start gobbling up territory as much as they can to protect their own interests and to also prevent the spread of influence from other rival nations like Russia or France. Prestige and strength, that goes back to the whole nationalism portion. Basically, it was like thumping your chest if you could go ahead and take over other people's territory. And economic, this isn't really any different than colonialism in my opinion, because you are basically trying to go to places to try and get new raw materials. The raw materials are things that weren't necessarily covered back in colonialism because we've had advances. So things like, I believe your textbook references tin and rubber are things that are in there. Now, normally what you would do in modern times is you would just trade with another country to get those things, but what you end up doing in this time period is you just basically go and take over their country, and then you have direct access for those things. So let's get into some things here. How do these images portray racism during imperialism? So this gets into the white man's burden portion. As you can see here, that text, the picture on the left is also in your textbook. It's basically talking about how the white man feels like he should go and spread civilization to the parts of the world. We can see some clearly racist pictures here in the center and the right, where you're basically washing the black off of someone, trying to turn them into being white. The thing that becomes interesting is, as we cover later on, especially with Belgium and Leopold II, is you have this false pretense of trying to spread civilization, and really it doesn't seem like that's the motivation, considering how you treat the African people once you finally bring them under your control. But much of what we cover in history is saying one thing and doing another. So talking back to balance of power, navies needed places to refuel. So they're eventually going to run out of coal because we're using steam power during this time. So you needed some locations to go ahead and refuel. We already talked about this earlier about how you're protecting interests, and that was with Britain trying to prevent areas where countries like Russia or France or other European nations could spread their influence. And you're basically just sitting there trying to protect the thing that you have. Nationalism is the other thing that we talk about in terms of trying to have imperialism go on. So some of the things that were done too is schools were kind of used to promote nationalism too. So you would basically use activities where you go ahead and examine a map and see which territories your nation has been able to go ahead and conquer. Newspapers went ahead and put out basically propaganda pieces trying to promote the whole aspects of imperialism as well. Let's talk about economic imperialism. Different than imperialism by governments. So what this is your textbook references this too. So if you're a business, you don't necessarily set up in areas where your country's government has taken over. You just basically try and move into where it's profitable for you. So you could be a British company and go ahead and set up operations inside of a territory in Africa that isn't necessarily controlled by your host country. And I already mentioned that why trade when you can take. So, instead of going ahead and just trading for things, you basically just move in and take direct control of them. Other things too, business concerns are greater than national concerns. And much of that is because, as your textbook mentions, is that a lot of the territory that the European nations decided to control was actually costing them a lot of money. It was like the costs far outweighed the benefits. So, if you're a business person, you don't really want to take that into concern. The only thing you're concerned about is trying to make money. Now, let's go ahead. Some other things too. A lot of the things that we had talked about in previous lesson with industrialization, those things occur here inside of African countries too, where people are basically locked into low-paying jobs. But we'll get into that later. So we have some responses too. So the Marxist response, your textbook references about how Marx had kind of hinted to some of these things, but it wasn't until Lenin, who is going to be your first leader of the Soviet Union, he basically pops off saying that capitalism was doomed to fail, and the reason for showing that is because you had to have businesses that were concentrated inside of Europe expand to areas and exploit their resources and their workers. So the solution is, the solution obviously is imperialism for them. And of course the cure for all of this, for capitalism, as far as Marx and Lenin were concerned, is basically summed up in this fantastic video that I remembered from watching The Simpsons back in the day. So let's go ahead and see what that looked like. Alright, so as we can see here, we're going to have our key concepts that were established earlier in the lesson here on the right. And we have our success criteria too. So you can see how each one of these go ahead and try and fit in with the goals that we were trying to accomplish at the beginning of the lesson. So take some time, go ahead and try and answer that. Okay, so some other things too that obviously allows for the Europeans to go ahead and be successful would be some of the tools of the trade that they use. So these are advancements that Europeans have that aren't necessarily spread to the African people. So the breech-loading rifle, which you can see up here in the picture in the upper portion. So basically that turns into where you can load one bullet at a time and basically take shots. Now the old way with the old muzzle-loading rifle, That was, you usually see those type of things in Civil War and Revolutionary War type things. All right, so some of the tools for the tools of trade that basically were used by Europeans that gave them distinct advantages are going to be things like the breech-loading rifle, which you can see a picture of at the top. Now, up until this time, anytime we looked at warfare, we kind of looked at things like muzzle-loading rifles. And if you're not familiar with what those look like, just anytime if you've ever seen a Revolutionary War, Civil War movie, it's those types where you got to load the ball in. It basically you could at best, I think the goal was to try and shoot 3 shots a minute. And with this one, obviously, you just put the bullet in. There's no packing. There's no taking out a ramrod and jamming the ball down in there. It's just put the bullet in and basically fire. So you could significantly increase the rate of fire that you had. And I think these came out at around 1860. I know that there were some soldiers in the Civil War that were using them for the United States when they were fighting against the South, so they'd be Union soldiers. I saw a documentary on that. Also, some other things too, as you can see in the lower right, is we have the machine gun that's created too. I don't know if that's exactly the type. It took me a little bit digging to just try and find pictures of World War I machine guns, but I think that's pretty much it. And obviously this isn't World War I, but these would be one of the tools that are used by European nations against each other. So obviously, a machine gun is going to have a far higher rate of fire than the breech-loading rifle, but still. I mean, imagine using old Civil War style guns against a nation that has breech-loading rifles and machine guns. Obviously, it's not going to go over very well. Some other advantages that we have here by the Europeans are things that we covered in other classes. So the understanding of infectious diseases, so that comes back with Louis Pasteur. This isn't in your textbook, but the creation of, I believe it's quinine. I don't know. It's not in your textbooks, and I didn't look up a phonetic spelling for it. But what that does is it's a medication that treats malaria. And if you know anything about Africa, malaria can be a problem there. So that allows the Europeans trying to go ahead and operate inside of Africa to do so without perhaps the threat of dying from malaria. Some other things that aren't in your textbook anywhere, but the College Board says that this is part of it, is to make sure that you understand that transportation and communication played a role too. So telegraph and steamships were one of the things that helped spread Europeans across Africa. I was wondering if maybe the development of railroad would play a part in that. Your textbook doesn't cover that, and as we talked about before, my concentration isn't necessarily European history, it's more of American history pre-Civil War. So a lot of the things that I pick up is from your textbook or other things I come across trying to prepare, but I didn't come across it in this case. Okay, so we're back to our second checking for understanding, so go ahead and take a moment, see if you can do it. Listen, describe the factors that enabled Europeans to conquer the people of Africa. And I've got Allison in the background here. Come here. Come here. Yeah. Say hi.
Hi.
Hi. Okay. All right, what do you need? All right, so that's going to be one of the difficulties I clearly have while working from home, is I'll occasionally have a visitor come in the middle of one of these, but that's okay. All right, so let's move forward, shall we? All right, Scramble for Africa. So prior to imperialism, only a few coastal areas were secured for the purpose of trade and missionary work, because the whole idea is that we weren't going to have we weren't going to try and gobble up territory, so there was no point in trying to move in. Obviously, that's going to change. So at the end of imperialism, we basically have this occur right before World War I. And so here's what Africa ends up looking like once we get ready to settle into World War I. As we can see, European countries control every single portion with the exception of the parts that are white, which obviously is basically, I don't know, we could say it's about 90% of Africa. We can see certain concentrations too. The French just basically settled in one area. The British were all over the place. We can see right in the center, that's where Belgium comes in. That's going to be where we talk about King Leopold II for a brief moment later on. There were some areas that were able to withstand imperialism, which we obviously can see in the white. We've mentioned them before. This is where, like Italy, we talked about how kind of useless Italy was. I mean, being nice, but they were kind of useless in trying to take over African areas. They did have some success, as your textbook points out, but they weren't able to take over Ethiopia, which I believe would be this white chunk right here. I do not know which countries are here, though, either. So, all right, as we can see here, too, obviously Italy took over some portions, but obviously this chunk right here is not going to work. All right. Some other things to talk about, too. So we're talking about Egypt right here. We can see that's going to be blue with the British, which leads us into our next slide. So Britain and Africa. And the reason why I make sure I spend some time talking about Britain and Africa is there have been DBQ prompts talking about expansion, or basically how views on, I can't even remember which one it was. It wasn't imperialism. It was one that was just talking about how people were viewed, like whites and Europeans viewed foreigners, which had to do, there was one specifically dealing with Egypt. That picture, let me go back to it real quick. It was this one. This picture was actually one of the prompts in the, yep, that's fantastic. Can you add some more green? Can you add some more green for land? Thank you. Okay. This was actually a picture in one of the DBQs that was talking specifically on imperialism. I think that had to do, that was the second year I taught it, so that would have been the year that Madison and Bianca passed, I believe. So let's keep going anyways. So talking about that, so they controlled South Africa, but that happens to lead to the Boer War. So that basically creates South Africa, excuse me. So one of the things that happened is basically British move in. Yes, honey. Yes, that is fantastic. Okay, can you move on to the next page? Mm-hmm. All right, thank you. Wait! I'm gonna have to pause this. All right, so getting back. So basically what had happened is there were two independent nations that tried to be created north of where South Africa was, and basically Britain brings them under control through the Boer War. Now, some of the things that happen is that they do get some negative feedback as far as back home. They're widely criticized in the British media because of the amount of money and the amount of lives that it costs in order to try and take over South Africa. One of the things that worked out very successful for the Boers was that they used guerrilla warfare. And if you don't remember what guerrilla warfare was, that's something that came up in class not too long ago, where basically you don't have organized battles. It's basically like hit and run tactics that were used, and you know, those were things that were popular with the Americans in the Revolutionary War. Those tactics were very successful for the Vietnamese in the Vietnam War against the United States. So again, these aren't really new tactics here. We also have the Suez Canal. So basically Britain shows up and is basically talking about, oh, we're only going to be here for a little while. They land in 1882, as it says there. But later they just like, no, we're going to be a protectorate. And so basically what that is they're just, what a protectorate is it's someone who controls another country, saying basically they're going to be just that. They're going to protect them. I don't know what they were trying to protect them from. Probably protecting them from being controlled by other European nations. Because as we can see here, let's think back to some of the things that we talked about in other lessons too, is how Britain basically controls India. They control them until after World War II. So what we can see here, I'm going to use the mouse here. So this canal right here allows you to cut through Egypt and then basically get a faster route into India. So I mean, just imagine how significantly shorter it is to go through this route rather than having to go the old-fashioned route all the way down around Africa to hit India. So it's a really big deal for the English to be able to get through the Suez Canal, especially if you're trying to do all your trade with India, who you already possess. I really don't know, you know, that just kind of this picture came with it. Don't worry about this one on the right. Okay, Portugal and France. So, I mean, there's nothing really big to talk about other than know that these countries had some possessions inside of there. And of course, I've got to do, it's not going to work. I'll get it later. There we go. That's a little Apex Legends reference, because Mozambique is a gun inside of Apex. It's the worst gun in the game, but just because it's actually related, I kind of threw it in there. So obviously, you know, Portugal controls Mozambique and Angola. France, French West Africa, which we showed was the upper left, the northwest portion of Africa. Tunisia and they are the protectorate of parts of Morocco. We'll be focusing, hopefully, I don't know what'll happen since we're getting delayed, but we do get to the part where a lot of French people are living in North Africa, and then they have to leave and come back to France because of what happens after World War II. But if we get there, we get there. Okay. Belgium and Leopold II. This is someone who I can't imagine, like, as bad as it is how Europeans treat Africans during imperialism, this guy is like, hold my beer, because he takes it to the next level. Like, he's acting in ways that are so, the treatment is so savage that other European nations are like looking at him like, bro, you gotta stop that stuff, because you're giving us a bad name. So obviously, if you're acting like that, you're clearly not upholding what his claim was. His claim was to expose Africa to civilization. We can tie that into the white man's burden. Clearly, that's not it. He was really just motivated by economic benefits here. Okay, because obviously, if you were so concerned about exposing people to civilization, you're pretty much acting like a barbarian in that case. But and here's Allison again. What's up? All right, back at it. Okay, so we're going to get into Germany as well. We're almost done here. Okay, Germany, that's, symbol of Prussia there on the right. We've already talked about how Bismarck doesn't want to get involved in imperialism, but we did talk about why they end up getting involved in imperialism, because it basically unites the social classes that were starting to get at each other's throats. So obviously he does it for political advantages. As far as what Germany controls, that's going to be Southwest Africa, the Cameroons. I don't even know how to say it. Togoland and Tanganyika. I'm sure I just absolutely butchered that, but I'm sure that's not going to, be part of your grade. All right. So let's talk about how it impacts Africa. Okay, natives tried to defend themselves but failed. Brutal treatment of blacks and loss through deception. So let's get into these. Obviously, you're not going to be able to defend yourself if you're using what are considered primitive weapons, like the muzzle-loading rifle against a machine gun and a breech-loading rifle. So it ended up in a lot of deaths for those who tried to prevent expansionism, imperialism. I did not put the reading in there for Black Man's Burden, but in your textbook it has that, and I'll talk about it in a moment, though. Brutal treatment of blacks. For that, we're going to basically, they get treated like second-class citizens. That's going to be something talked about in a moment, too. Loss through the deception. There's a part in your textbook that talks about how Europeans had deceived them, where basically what would happen is that they would ask for someone to show them where gold was at, and so then they would have this discussion, and then they come back with a piece of paper that was a contract that said, well, this is the agreement we actually talked about, and the agreement is actually not what they talked about. It's something that basically gives away all their mineral rights. So instead of sharing things, the Europeans come in and use deception through legal contracts. Obviously the person that they're dealing with it's probably not going to be written in a language that they know. It's going to be written in English on purpose, knowing that the person is going to not know what the terms are. And so, yeah, they deceive them into getting more of their property. Okay, basically, how Africans feel are hopeless. In the Black Man's Burden in your textbook, it's a response to the White Man's Burden from, I think it's Rudyard Kipling, is they talk about how they were able to withstand the basically invasion and influence of Europeans through colonialism and all up until the 1850s, 60s, and late 1800s. But right now, the way that they feel is like it's inevitable that they're not going to be able to withstand the invasion of the white man. And so essentially you can sum it up in one word. The Black Man's Burden is they feel that they are helpless, that they can't do anything to prevent European invasion. Okay, so this gives us to our next checking for understanding. So we can see here, how did each of the following play a role in imperialism? Obviously the advantage of doing a video lesson is you can always rewind it and fill things into. How were Africans impacted by imperialism? We can go ahead and handle that too. So I'll give you some time to go ahead and try and figure that out. You can pause the video, you can listen to this music that's going to be going on in the background, or whatever you feel like. All right, we're heading into the home stretch here. We're talking about responses to imperialism. Most were used to rule by small groups of elites. So for some Africans, they kind of didn't really notice much of a change because they were already being ruled by someone. Now it's just being ruled by someone else. So that was the one I kind of had hinted at the beginning, where I'm like, it might surprise you, where some people just, oh, hey, we're ruled by somebody else now. There were three views on culture. We have traditionalists. Those are people who were desperately trying to hold on to their cultures and traditions that they had established and obviously long held before Europeans showed up. Then you had modernizers who were extremists too, who basically felt like the ways of the old traditions were useless and they needed to modernize as much as possible. Some people believe that basically by modernizing, you could go ahead and embrace the new cultures and advantages that were superior to your own, and then somehow use those to basically fight the whites and the Europeans to get them out of your country later on. But for the most of us, you have somebody or people who are kind of like in between, a mix of both. So it's like, hey, I like some of the new stuff, but hey, I don't want to give up on my traditions and customs either. So it leads to resentment. Over time, because what ends up happening is that Africans learn of European ideas like those in the Enlightenment. That kind of seems like we had talked about that before, where ideas of the Enlightenment transferred over to South America, and they realized that they weren't really being treated how Europeans had talked about, and then they had their rebellions. We don't end up we have some sort of rebellion going on, but we don't have it where Africans won't really win their independence. We'll talk about that later, where basically it just becomes after World War One, where it's just too expensive to maintain those areas. I know we had talked about earlier how a lot of the areas that Europe had controlled in Africa were just basically money pits where you were sinking money in and not necessarily getting profits out of. It was more for that prestige and thumping your chest type moment. So Africans realized, just like the South Americans did, that the rules don't apply to them, and the people who were middle class at that time could only get low level jobs within the bureaucracy. Obviously, you're not going to have the working class have access to that. Your working class people were affected as well. They lost their farms, and then if you lost your farms, it's kind of like what we talked about with the agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution. When you can't work on the farm anymore, you end up working in the factories. So as more and more Europeans come into the scene in Africa too, you end up having the beginnings of segregation. You have separate churches and schools for whites compared to blacks and Africans. So what we end up having as well is talking about how they're not treated as well is your textbook references how they would basically refer to, or Europeans would refer to Africans as boy, or would refer to them by their first name rather than Mr. or Ms. or Mrs., which obviously, in today's time, referring to someone by their first name isn't so disrespectful. Back then it would be, and it's still seen as racist today to have a white person call a black person boy in a demeaning term. And by boy, that would be like me referencing someone my own age. As boy, when I'm talking about in class, referring to a boy, it's not meant in a demeaning manner. So obviously you have to use some judgment in that one. Okay, some new political parties emerge too. These are going to be people who are working for the rights of natives, and they'll basically be fighting for trying to get more acceptance and more rights underneath the control of European countries. Basically, this will end up turning into another version of how nationalism takes hold of people, because Africans are going to be tired of being controlled by Europeans, and they're going to want to be able to control themselves. Checking for understanding 3, describe ways in which Africans reacted to imperialism. So take some time and focus on finishing that off. And then we also have our final check for understanding. That's going to wrap up our video for today. Hopefully you liked it. Maybe hit the like button or not. Doesn't really matter, I guess. If you have any questions about what was in the video, put those in the comments and I'll respond to them. It also helps from me getting my email box flooded with questions that may have already been asked and answered. So we'll try and hit back in about 2 days. Until then, you're going to say bye? Say bye. Look right here. Right here.
Bye.
All right. We'll see you next time. Bye.